Hello, John. How are you? So nice to see you again.
I'm very well. How are you?
I'm doing great. Our mutual friend, Matthew Stafford, connected us. And I
Yes.
had the pleasure of reading your book and talking to you a few weeks ago. And we had a lot of fun talking about all kinds of topics. And I wanted to have you on the show because your book, The Power of Letting Go, How to Drop Everything That's Holding You Back, made a big impression on me. And I told you I read it twice and I took so many notes and I had to really limit myself so that we can cover some of what's in your book in the next hour or so.
Okay.
But thank you for indulging me.
Yeah. Well, thanks for inviting me. Here we are.
Well, I want to start from the beginning, if you let me. And I ask my
Good.
guests about those early days, childhood and upbringing, and how do you think that time shaped you? And I know you have stories that some of them you share in your book.
Um, I think, well, in terms of what's relevant to your audience, like a lot of people, a lot of psychologists say something traumatic happened in your childhood. Tell me about your childhood, all of that. In my case, when I, around my fourth birthday, we moved to Leicester. Those Americans listening to this may know of Leicester because the body of Richard III was found in a parking lot a few years ago. That's
I
how
remember
Leicester suddenly
that.
became famous, right? Before that, most people didn't know where it was. And Leicester has its own particular accent, and this is not it. And so when I started discovering these traumatic episodes, the first one I discovered was my first day at school when I turned up talking like this. This is BBC export English, right? And
It's beautiful.
and I turned up talking like this, and the other children and the teacher had Leicester accents, so they laughed at me, and I
Uh-huh.
felt unacceptable. So when I first got into this topic in depth, I realized, okay, that was the first time I could remember feeling really bad. I mean, I've since gone back earlier, but in the
Mm-hmm.
book, The Power of Letting Go, when I wrote that book, which is 5 years ago, I'd got, when I first connected with my guru, I quickly identified first day at school as being, a major traumatic event. But everybody
Mm-hmm.
has one. Everybody's got this. So,
So you realize that you're different. And I think what happens to us at first, we want to blend in and be like everybody else. But I realized that over time, we start to appreciate we start to appreciate the fact that we're different. So in that moment, it felt like I think you wanted to be like all the other kids, but there must have been a moment when you realized it's okay that I'm different, and maybe you could lean into it.
yes. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting you say that. I'm just completing another book, so I've gone into this further. So what seems to happen is we have this traumatic experience, and and we come to a conclusion about ourselves, right? So I concluded that I was unacceptable,
Mm-hmm.
and then this pain pattern. So Swamiji, my guru, says everybody's life is run by five or six pain patterns, right? So let's
Right.
take that one. I'm unacceptable. Right. And then you could say it looks as though some good came out of it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I noticed, for example, so I'm unacceptable. I don't fit in with the other children. And pretty soon I realized the only way to get love and appreciation was to work hard and do well in my exams and win prizes and all this stuff, right? So for the next 20 years, I studied hard and I won prizes and all of that. And along the way, I kind of noticed, um, most of my friends are also not acceptable. So at that time, let's say it's changed, but at that time, let's say Britain was 95% white, and um, and I grew up in a city. I mean, Leicester had a rapidly growing Asian population, but let's say it's a majority white country, and I realized, well, how come most of my friends are like Ukrainian or Jewish or Asian or Irish or like, and by the time we got to the Oxford and Cambridge entrance examinations, I'm in this room with like well, Jewish, Polish, all the outsiders, all the unacceptables, getting love and appreciation by being clever and hardworking, right? And then the in
Uh-huh.
crowd were playing football or having a good
Mm-hmm.
time together. So I did notice there was this kind of outsider syndrome going on. And you might say, well, on the face of it, that's great. You discover this success formula, which is to be intelligent and hardworking. And so, in my case, it culminated with winning first prize at business school and then being diagnosed with clinical depression. Right. So,
Mm-hmm.
my winning formula collapsed at the age of 26. Some people's, what Swamiji says is that, even your successes come from what he calls incompletion. They come from even your successes come from pain. And so I see this so much in business. You see, I mean, for example, there was a whole crop of British investment banks, right, they've all gone now, but they were all acquired by other banks, but they were called merchant banks, right? Practically all of them were founded by Jewish immigrants, right? So, and then if you look at immigrant entrepreneurs in various countries around the world, like people who were kicked out of their countries or nearly murdered, or, I mean, where I grew up in Leicester, Idi Amin just kicked out all the Asians. He just said, right, all go, right? And then whatever it was, 28,000 of them ended up in the UK. So you can see this thing, like there's this massive trauma which leads to success in business or whatever, but that doesn't resolve the trauma.
No, it's
They
a huge.
just succeed in a certain way for a certain time.
It's a force that can motivate.
It does motivate, but at some point, as far as I can see, at some point it breaks down. But it makes things work for quite a long period. Yeah.
In a second, I want to ask you about this fascinating life that you've had, which is on one side very business, corporate oriented, and you can tell us in a second what you do these days. But then you were looking for enlightenment and more spiritual understanding of your life and who you are. I just wanted to share one little story when you talked about being unacceptable. I'm left-handed, and when I went to school, it was, for a long time, people were forced to switch the right hand, and I was no longer. But I was looked at as unacceptable in some way. My handwriting was very poor, and I remember a teacher showing me around, and for me to see how the other kids are writing and how my handwriting is so bad. And to make it worse, the other kid in the class that was left-handed was the absolute worst student we had. And he was just not, and I don't know if it was because he was not, gifted or whatever you want to call it, but maybe he was told he's just not capable. But I had this memory that I definitely don't want to be the worst student, and I turned out to be a decent student. But John, I went to college and I sat down, and it was an entry exam, hard to get into, and I'm sitting down and I'm looking left to right, and I've seen more left-handed people sitting next to me that day than my entire 18-year-old life before.
All right.
And then I learned about other people that are left-handed who did just fine. And I wonder that we didn't do just fine because we always had a slightly different perspective on the world. Like everything is flip-flopped in our hands, heads and hands. And we see things differently. There are presidents, actually a disproportionate number of U.S. presidents that have been left-handed just as a... Really? Yeah. And then
that does make sense. I mean, one thing that happened, I became super sensitive to accents, obviously. And then I became fascinated by languages. So I learned lots of languages at school. And that's how I got into Cambridge, mainly because of languages, right? So these things become, who is it? I think Richard Branson and many British entrepreneurs are dyslexic, right?
There you go.
And then they compensate by developing phenomenal memories or whatever. So in his case. Yeah.
It's okay to be different, and I think it took me time to appreciate it, and I didn't have that in me when I was 7. But tell me about those two sides to your life. You're on this corporate path, everything looks like a success, and suddenly you need something else. You're looking for something different.
Well, I mean, we look back over our lives and we interpret it in different ways, right, as we go along. Like we keep reframing.
Right.
The way I see it right now was, I was brought up to believe that I was a body mind, which I think most people in the West are brought up that way. So if you look at economics and finance and marketing and law and medicine and most disciplines in the West, they assume that human beings are body minds, right? So you're trying to get what you want and avoid what you don't want, right? So I spent 10 years going to church and Sunday school. So there's a spiritual thing there. They tell you have a soul. Okay, fine. But certainly at business school at INSEAD, and the rest of the time, the assumption is you're a body mind. It's this unspoken assumption, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then now there are 8 billion other body minds, right? And everybody's trying to get what they want and avoid what they don't want. And so you go along that way, and so for a while that approach worked pretty well, because you go through what you call high school in the US, you go to university. I worked in analytical type jobs in banking and consulting. I went to INSEAD, so even more analysis. And so that view of the world worked fine up
Mm-hmm.
to the age of 26. Well, it worked extremely well up to the age of 26. And then, so I wanted to work either as a fund manager or in executive search. And I knew from experience I didn't want to work in investment banking or management consulting. So
Mm-hmm.
I was perfectly qualified to do these two jobs I didn't want to do. And the two jobs I was really interested in, which is fund management and executive search, I suddenly realized actually people who are good at those two things have tremendous intuition.
Right.
And intuition, my favorite definition of intuition is immediate insight without reasoning.
I love that.
That's the
Mm-hmm.
definition in the Carter World English Dictionary. So immediate insight without reasoning. And I realized after all this analysis and learning languages and everything, I realized my intuition had basically died. So the thing that I was really interested in, I just had no clue how to do it. And that's when I became very depressed, because I realized, okay, so I'm really well qualified to do these things I don't want to do.
Right.
And the thing I really want to do, I don't seem to have any aptitude for. And then I started waking up very early in the morning and all that. And then I got diagnosed with clinical depression. So to answer your question, I moved on to this. I started getting interested in spirituality, because this kind of the handling life through my mind stopped working.
Mm-hmm.
So his full name's, well, one of his full names is Sri Nithyananda Paramashivam, so we call him Swamiji, long name. But he basically says that most human beings are trying to live through their minds.
True.
And what I've noticed in my career is there comes a point where you can't handle life through your mind anymore. It just doesn't work. Well, you probably run into this. There are people who try to manage their relationships with their minds,
Mm-hmm.
and I notice it, for example, because these days I tend to recruit chief executives and other C-suite people, and I also get involved in financing companies, right? And what I've noticed with chief executives is some of them, they're fine with 50 people.
Mm-hmm.
But if they try to apply the same approach to managing 500 or 5,000 or 50,000, it doesn't work anymore. It just, their success formula breaks down.
Mm-hmm.
And they get incredibly stressed, some of them. Because the mental approach just doesn't work beyond a certain level, right?
It's fascinating what you share. I manage money for families, long-term patient capital, and I see it as lifelong relationships with the clients. They trust me with their lifetime of savings and a family fortune and money they can't afford to lose. You build a certain relationship. But then I turn around and I invest that money. And John, I've been in meetings with managements of companies where on an intellectual level, all the numbers look great.
Yeah.
And I walk away with a very uneasy, uncomfortable feeling that I don't trust these people.
Yeah.
And I would come back and I would talk to my colleagues and I would say, I can't make an argument with anything analytical here, but I wouldn't leave my wallet with the individuals I just spoke with. I wouldn't. And years pass, and I'm not going to mention the company, but there was a fraud, accounting issues, the management was fired. So somebody eventually found what was wrong with the story that was told. But on this gut feeling level, I don't know, intuition, whatever you want to call it. There was no reasoning. I couldn't find a fact, but I just couldn't invest, and I didn't invest. And it's very hard to propose that and talk about it in so many corporate settings, because you have to do a write-up, have a report, have the facts, have the bullet points. What kind of a bullet point do I put this in? But on a human level, we all get it. And my clients get it. And the people I work with get it. People just get it.
Yeah. Well, thank God. I mean, I was very fortunate or blessed when I I finally started working in executive search when I was 35, and I was working for the chairman of one of the big five executive search firms. So he was the chairman of Europe, and he had a PhD. He had a PhD in astrophysics from Cambridge, right? So
Mm-hmm.
he was not stupid, and he would. So I was recruiting the chief financial officers. He basically said, "Please go off and set up the CFO practice. You do the chief financial officers. I'll recruit the chief executives and the chair." And so, very quickly, I was recruiting CFOs for very big companies very quickly, right?
Uh-huh.
And what was really interesting, he didn't talk about intuition, but he would say, "Okay, so you've got this candidate, this chief financial officer, who you're proposing to work with this chief executive," and he used to say, "Can you see them together?" And then I would kind of trot out this rational stuff. He said, "No, can you see them together?" And I realized after a while it was a purely intuitive question.
Uh-huh.
Like, you can either see them together or you can't.
Right.
And you can rattle off all these your rationale as much as you want, but if you can't see them together, forget it. Which to me is another form of another way of expressing intuition.
I love the sound of it.
A bit like what
John,
you're saying. It doesn't feel right.
it doesn't feel right, and it's okay to trust that feeling, even if you can't explain it. And I think it comes with experience that you say it's okay to rely on
Yeah,
it. And since I've met people that come across as very mind driven, and they would
yeah,
pull me aside and they would ask me, "But Bogumil, how does it feel?" And I was asking for some career advice at different points in my life, and they would
mm,
say, "I hear you, I see it, but how does it feel?"
mm,
And I thought it's such a peculiar question coming from somebody that I see as a very mind-driven, very
yeah,
intellectual person, that on some level they get it, that it's sometimes something that we can't explain with bullet points and numbers and statistics. It just doesn't feel
yeah,
right.
yeah.
Let's get right into the heart of your book. There's a quote that I really love in your book, if I may share it. You say, "You don't need to control everything that's happening. You don't need to push, struggle, fight, force things, or try to manipulate people in order to make things the way you want them to be. It's exhausting and unnecessary." What's another way to go about life?
um, yeah, yeah. Thank you. Nice question. By the way, I've since gone much deeper into this. You know,
Uh-huh.
uh,
Let's go there.
yeah. So I would say there are two ways of approaching life, right? To simplify, one approach is to live through your mind,
Mm-hmm.
and or in the Eastern tradition that would also be called your ego. And
Right.
so what you then do, and this is the way most people live, I would say, in the West, is you're solving one problem after another. So
True.
you know what you want to happen. Your mind thinks up some plan to get there, and then you just solve one problem after another, trying to get there. Right? Right. But this is based on an unspoken assumption. It's based on the assumption that you are a body mind and you're separate from everybody. Right.
Right.
And this is, I'm going to be, well, I'm just going to be very direct. If you look at the Abrahamic religions, so Judaism, Christianity, and Islam,
Mm-hmm.
God and human beings are separate.
Right.
And a whole load of people from those traditions have since abandoned the idea of God. Right. So
Mm-hmm.
then it's just human beings on their own. But even when they believe in God, God is separate from them, and maybe sitting in judgment or whatever. But basically, we're on our own, and then we deal with other human beings, and we try to get them to do things to fit in with our plan. Right.
Sure. We
We go
try.
through life. We go through life trying to get what we want, and then trying to get other people to cooperate with our plan.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
And and it and sometimes we try to manipulate people, and they don't want to be manipulated, and we try and push them
No.
to do things. So it's very, very stressful. But but what's interesting to me about that is there's this unspoken assumption that you are separate,
Mm-hmm.
and if there is a God, this God is separate as well, right?
Right.
And I mean, I have lots of Jewish friends, and some of them said, well, after the Holocaust, we gave up on, we stopped believing in God, so now it's just us on our own, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, and a lot, I mean, by the way, church attendance in the UK, fewer than 1 million people go to the Church of England every week, right? So Christianity is pretty much collapsed in the UK, or
Mm-hmm.
formal Christianity, right? So that's one way to live, right? Is there's no God, or if there is a God, he's not helping very much. And
Hmm.
we have to go and live our lives over here, right? That's one approach. The other approach comes from the Dharmic religions, which is Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism. And when I first met Swamiji in India, this was 10 years, well, I got connected to him 10 years ago, and I went to see him in August. I went on a program. And looking back, it was a blessing because there were 24 of us. I think, there's not 24, there were 54 of us, right? The last time I saw him, there were 4,000. Right? For the first time,
You were
54.
early.
Yeah, well, yeah. So there were 54 of us, and he said it many times. He says, I'm not here to convince you that I am God. He said, I'm here to convince you that you are God. And
Uh-huh.
this is completely different. This is saying,
Uh-huh.
okay, you are divine. And by the way, some Westerners have said this, right? I've
Hmm.
heard Westerners say, you are God, right? So it's not black and white. But he basically says, he says, you are God, you are divine, right? And I mean, and basically what it is that, I mean, to paraphrase, there's an intelligence which is running everything all the time,
Hmm.
including, you, me, the traffic, our bodies, the birds, the trees, right? There's this underlying intelligence which is running everything. And
Hmm.
if you let go completely, if you surrender, which is a scary word for most Westerners, if you surrender, you tune into that underlying intelligence and then things happen naturally, right?
Hmm.
And so it's a totally different approach. And you're no longer separate. You basically drop your ego and just merge with this intelligence. And then all kinds of magic happens, right? And he describes that as living enlightenment. And I've had so many experiences in the last few years where when I surrender, things just work out. I mean, astonishing. But it's a jump, right? Because you have to drop your ego to get to that place of
Right.
surrender where everything works out.
No,
So
it's
that's
it's
the
beautiful.
the alternative
Yeah.
is he calls it, he's got this 800-page book called Living Enlightenment, and I would say
Uh-huh.
that's the alternative to living from your mind.
It's fascinating, and I think it's a very uncomfortable thing to propose to people who are.
Well, it's blissful when you're there, but when you're
Uh-huh.
not there, looking at it, you think, God, this is scary.
Because we have plans, agendas, task lists, and you name it, and
Hmm.
there's this illusion that the bigger control we exercise over our day and every minute of the day, we'll get to where we're going, won't we?
Yeah, well, we
And then
believe that until one day it stops working, right? I mean, some
exactly.
people have scary experience, like, a near-death experience, or something happens to them, and then they start to question the mind-based approach, right?
We'll come back to the topic of letting go, but I want to ask you about something that you brought up last time we spoke, and I hope it's okay for me to bring it
Yeah,
up. You
fine.
tell me. But it's a quote from your guru that really stayed with me, and I've been thinking about it ever since we spoke. You said that he told you
So
that if you aren't,
I didn't hear that bit. It cut out.
so the quote from Swamiji that you shared with me was, if you aren't wealthy, there's a problem with your consciousness.
Yeah, yes.
And it's such a powerful statement. And ever since you told me that, and I think you might have told me towards the end of our last conversation, and I've
Yeah.
been thinking about it a lot. Can
Mm.
you unpack it a little bit for us? What does it mean to you?
Well, to expand a bit on what he also says, you're either working for wealth or you're working for poverty, right?
Mm-hmm.
Let's be kind of no neutral. So to unpack it a bit, uh, so if we talk about these patterns which are running our lives, right? So he says, and by the way, last year I did it in great depth. I found
Mm-hmm.
six pain patterns. It's almost like lines of code in software. Like there were six pain patterns running my life. One of which is I'm unacceptable, right? So let's
Right.
say, like, I want to be wealthy, or I want to be well paid, or I want to have plenty of money, whatever it is. Like lots of people would like to be wealthy or have plenty of money or enough money, right? And
Mm-hmm.
then you can do it as an exercise and say, okay, my goal is that I want a certain amount of money, or I want to earn a certain amount of money, or I want to have no problems with money, whatever it is, right? And then if you listen it's best to express it in the positive, right? I want X amount of money, right? If you write that down on the top of a piece of paper and then listen carefully to yourself, your mind will tell you all the reasons why it can't happen.
Yes.
right? And it could be like, I mean, it varies from one person to another. Like, you're too stupid, you're too old, you're too young, you don't have an MBA, you're not a CFA. I don't know. You come from a poor family. Your mind will think
Hmm.
up all these reasons why it can't happen, right?
Right.
And this is where we come to the consciousness, is so basically in your consciousness, you have these beliefs. So Swamiji says, you don't manifest your desires, you manifest your beliefs. So if you have a
Hmm.
belief, like for example, imagine you have a belief, no one in my family ever makes any money, right? For example,
That's a
if that's
belief.
your
Yeah.
belief, it's going to be pretty hard to manifest any money, right?
Hmm.
Or you might have a belief which is not about you, it's about the world, like life is tough,
Hmm.
or you know. So if you believe life is tough, or people don't support me, or life isn't fair, if you've got one of those beliefs, it's going to be very hard to manifest wealth, right? So that's what I think he's saying when he talks about there's a problem with your consciousness. It's a bit like there's a problem with your software.
Uh-huh.
And
Uh-huh.
he says, the good news is it's software, not hardware. You can do something about the software. So
We can fix it. And we'll
yeah, we
come
can
back
do
to the
it.
yeah, and I want to come back to the patterns. I find it
Mm,
fascinating, but speaking of exercises, you said about writing down the amount of money you want. You have an exercise in the book that I really liked, and I don't want to forget. You propose to write down on a list of everything you expect to happen in your life. And
right.
I thought of it just the way you even phrase it. It's the things that you expect to happen, right? So it's not really goals, but you kind of course, these things will happen. Tell
Yeah.
me more
Or,
about this exercise.
or not. Yeah. Yeah.
Or yeah, yeah, of course, if you don't want them to happen. Tell me more
Yeah.
about this exercise.
Um, to be frank, I haven't thought about it for a long time.
Uh-huh.
So writing down your expectations, yeah, is I suppose what I would say is it once you start tuning into this intelligence which is running the cosmos, a lot of
Mm-hmm.
expectations they just turn out to be nonsense, right? I mean, I had an expectation. So I joined one of the world's biggest executive search firms, right? I had an expectation I would spend the rest of my career there, right? And there
Uh-huh.
was a big downturn, and I got fired after 5 years. Well, that's that expectation out the window, right? Um,
There you go.
and when I was a student, I decided not to write any books because it was pointless. I went to this library that had 1 million books. So the Cambridge University Library had 1 million books. Apparently, it's now 3 or 4 million, right? And
Uh-huh.
I went there, and they said, "Well, we've got 1 million books." And I just thought, "Well, writing books is clearly pointless. I'm not going to do that, right?" And and now four have been published, right? So
Mm-hmm.
you kind of realise that I realised after a while my assumptions or expectations are kind of by the by, really, because the cosmos has other ideas, and the
Where do they
cosmos.
come where do they come from? Because we all have them. I should have this house, or I should have this job, or I should have
Yeah,
a corner
yeah.
office. Where does it come from?
Well, they come from. I mean, I won't go into detail about the new book, but well, there are all these things that come up. Some of them are what Swamiji calls borrowed desires, which I talked about in the Paralatin Go. So for
Mm-hmm.
example, wanting to have children because your parents want to have grandchildren. Like you may or
Right.
may not want to have children, but your parents want to have grandchildren, right? So that's a borrowed
Mm-hmm.
desire. Or wanting a Ferrari because your brother wants a Ferrari. You may have no interest in Ferraris, but you might feel that you ought to want a Ferrari. So some of
Right.
them are borrowed desires. Some are desires that come from incompletion, from pain, right? So I mean, a trivial example would be I feel bad about myself, so I eat a whole chocolate cake. Like, so I have a
Mm-hmm.
desire to eat a whole chocolate cake, but it comes from feeling bad about myself, and then I become overweight or I get diabetes and I feel worse. So
Mm-hmm.
some of the expectations or desires, they come from pain or we borrowed them from someone else. They're not pure desires, right? They come from all kinds of other places. Or, you go to business school and everybody else wants to be an investment banker, so you think you ought to be an investment banker. Well, maybe,
Mm-hmm.
maybe not. It's just what everyone else was doing.
Well, I went through that phase when I was in grad school, and everybody wanted to be an investment banker.
Right.
And and I applied, And at the time, I knew I want to be in the investment management business and manage money and learn more about that. And I learned about Buffett and Peter Lynch. But I did go to interviews, and they were really eye-opening. I don't know if I told you the story, but one of the interviewers, he took me aside and he said, it looks like it's all lining up very well for you, and it looks like you will get this internship position. And all the kids I knew wanted that one particular opportunity. But he said, you're going to hate yourself. It's going to be awful. You're not going to sleep well. You're going to learn a lot. But I think it was his moment of like openness and honesty coming from somebody that was in such a rigid corporate shape and form appearing in my life. But there's this moment of, you have to know this before you make this decision moment, when he just spoke in a way like a messenger from heavens. I don't know how to describe it. And I thought, I think he has a point, and I should not accept that role. And I didn't. And I went with the investment management side, which was my true calling. And I knew it was my true calling, and I'm glad I did. But I wanted to see what it takes to get that opportunity. I think on some level, I wanted to know what it would take. But somehow I got so close, yet he told me, this is what you should expect, and think twice if this is what you want to experience.
Well, it's very kind of him to say that.
Very kind of him. John, you write about being present, and you have this concept of pure consciousness. And I like how you explain that we all experience fleeting moments of that kind of presence. We're on top of a mountain. We're admiring the beauty of the landscape. And for a second, we forget everything else. We even forget ourselves. We're just in the moment. That's how I was reading your book. But then you add that we can have more of those moments, and they can happen longer and more often. Can you talk about those moments?
Certainly. Actually, I can tell you about something. Well, in The Power of Letting Go, I talked about mindfulness, right? Which has become an industry. I looked the other day, there are 60, if you go onto Amazon.com and type mindfulness into the book section, there are 60,000 titles, right?
I wouldn't be surprised.
It's become enormous. I'm now writing about a new technique, which will help people. I'll explain it now, which Swamiji calls unclutching, right? So what happens is, if you just sit there, a thought will appear, right? And nearly everybody unconsciously decides to engage with the thought. And most people have not been taught this. When a thought arises, we engage with the thought. So we may entertain the thought, think about it. One thought leads to another thought. Pretty soon we're miles away. We're in the past or the future. We get, or we may resist it, right? I don't like that thought. I'm going to suppress it. But one way or another, we engage with it, right? We may analyze it. Say, well, my psychotherapist taught me about these thoughts. I need to analyze this. So, but that's an unconscious decision to engage with a thought, but you don't have to. So the alternative is you just, Swamiji calls it unclutching. You just don't engage with it. And initially, what I found is if you have a kind of academic training, it feels very lazy because these thoughts are coming and you're doing nothing about them. You're just not engaging. But if you carry on unclutching, pretty soon you find yourself in this kind of empty space. And it's pure consciousness, right? Because the thoughts come up, but you don't engage with them, so they kind of go away. And that's it's profound. It's very simple principle, but it's profound. Because if you keep unclutching all day long, well, your mind clutches every now and then when you have to deal with something like, where are my keys? Or writing. But the rest of the time, you can just keep unclutching. And if you keep doing that, you'll keep it, repeatedly experience pure consciousness. I mean, people experience when they do deep meditation or yoga or maybe swimming or something like that, but you can experience it throughout the day.
It's a practice, it's a muscle. And I think at first it's really hard. And then over time you can be more aware of it. It's
Yeah,
definitely practice for me, and there's an endless flow of thoughts that I have, work related
yeah,
or life related, and there's
yeah.
this voice that's judging everything. This is good, this is not good, that's what you wanted, that's not what you wanted.
There's somebody, I don't remember which author it is, it might be Eckhart Tolle. He kind of describes that as your cellmate. So you're in prison with this guy who keeps commenting on everything.
And he has so much to say, and I didn't even ask, and
Exactly. He has
that's
opinions and advice.
but there are moments you talk about meditation, but it could be a walk. I like surfing, and when you're surfing, you need your entire attention on the
Yeah,
moment at hand, right? You have to pay attention to the wave, to the water, to the board, everybody else,
yeah,
and you just go.
yeah,
And then you stop and you look back and you realize for the last 2 minutes, I haven't had any thought
yeah,
not
exactly.
related to what I was doing.
Yeah,
And in sports, it happens. People performing music. My wife plays the harp, and I can see how she's completely lost in the moment.
yeah,
So we can create those, but it's harder to create that outside of that context that requires so much of our
yeah,
attention
yeah. I
and
think that may
repeat
be
it.
why people enjoy things like skiing or dancing or surfing is it absorbs your attention completely, so you can't you gives you a break from all these chaotic thoughts, right?
You share in your book, and we brought it up already in this conversation, but I want to talk more about it. The pain patterns,
Yes.
and you call them the incompletions, and you
Yeah.
explain how it's the pain that runs our life, and
Yes.
it's usually the pain in the distant past. Can you
Well,
talk about it?
it starts in the distant past, and then it grows like a
Yes.
tree. So in my case, I've gone all the way back to the age of 1,
Mm-hmm.
and then by the age of 7, I can see there are clearly 6 patterns, right? But then it carries on growing like a tree because you then have other experiences, and
Yeah, confirm
branches
it.
grow until you've
Mm-hmm.
got this massive oak tree.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, of all your painful experiences.
It gets bigger and bigger.
Yeah, yeah. But the good news is you can pull it out by the root.
Well, you propose an exercise of repeating the story to yourself, whatever that story is, looking in the
Yeah,
mirror. Do I remember it right? And
yeah, yeah,
and I thought it was such an interesting idea because when that story is silently repeated in your head, it kind of
yeah,
sounds true. But if you look at yourself, and I don't know if that's the element that really triggers me when I tried to do that and looking in the mirror and me telling myself the story,
yeah,
after the fifth time, I think this is just a story, and it gets sillier and sillier the more I hear it. Right? Like
yeah.
it's made
Were
up.
you doing it in the present?
Well, it was usually about something in the past, but doing in the present, is that what you mean? Yes. Like, so I would sit down and tell myself a story that I picked one of them, whatever it was. I mean, I think
Yeah,
it took me a long time to understand that me being left-handed is not a disadvantage. I think it's one of the stories that I needed to undo in my head, and there are many others.
I mean, Swamiji just the way he summarizes that exercise is relive to relieve. So it's not remember or recall or
Hmm.
reconcile all of those things. It's relive, and it may be 10,000 years old, that exercise, right? I mean, the
Hmm.
principle is thousands of years old. Swamiji put it in a very neat package, but it is so powerful. I mean, I'll give you and this I'm sure this will help your listeners. So let's take a business context, right? Uh, I find, by the way, if I relive very thoroughly, I frequently can't remember what it was because it's gone, right? But I'll give you an example. I I was recently doing something in business, and a couple of board members were not returning my calls,
Hmm.
and I felt Swamiji calls it incomplete. I felt it was painful for me. So I thought I'm in this situation where these guys are not returning my calls. And I thought, okay, so there's pain that's being triggered in me. And then the question is, what's the pain pattern or incompletion or cognition? What is it? Or bit of software. What is there? And I realized I had this cognition or belief or whatever you want to call it, which is they don't care about me. Right.
Right.
So then I thought, okay, so they don't care about me. what's my earliest memory of people not caring about me? And at that time, I went back to the day I was fired by this executive search firm.
Mm-hmm.
And some people, I was due to give a talk that evening, and they turned up to our big meeting room for this talk. And I told a couple of people who'd been to the same business school that I'd just been fired. I mean, I was a partner. And I said, by the way,
Mm-hmm.
I've just been fired. And I had this strong feeling they just didn't care. They weren't interested. They'd come to hear the
Mm-hmm.
talk and a bit of networking. And that was painful. And I thought, okay, so what I need to do is I need to relive that. So
Mm-hmm.
I closed my eyes. We do it, the mirror is part of it, but I closed my eyes. I intensely relived. I'm in this room and I tell these two people that I've been fired, but they don't seem to care. And I could feel all this pain in my heart chakra. And then I did it again in the mirror. And then we do it again talking. We have an image of Swamiji, which we call the Atmamurti. So we talk to him, right? And I intensely relive this. And then, you do it 5 times at least. And at some point, this pain leaves your body, right? Because the pain
Mm-hmm.
is stored in your body. And then, guess what? Within 24 hours, they both call me back. So what happens is, and this is maybe a new concept, but it will be a new concept for lots of people listening. The concept is that we're creating our own reality. And the
Right.
world is not the world as described by Sir Isaac Newton. It's not separate objects, right?
Mm-hmm.
When we change our cognitions, the outside world shifts. And I've
Mm-hmm.
experienced so many times when I remove the pain pattern, whatever it is, when I find and remove the pain pattern, the outside world suddenly shifts. And in business, it's hugely practical.
We collect those experiences in personal life and in business, like you
Yeah,
collected. And I'm thinking in the
yeah,
investment world, I
yeah,
work with people that are very affluent, and I see how there are a lot of stories, experiences around money, and it's a very
yeah.
sensitive topic.
Mm,
And just one anecdote comes to mind. I notice if you're an investor over a long period of time, you get to see a lot of things that went wrong.
yeah,
And I've had the experience of working with people that were, have seen 50, 60 years of different markets. And I think by that point, they've collected so many negative experiences that
yeah,
they're trying to avoid pain.
yeah,
There's a story of Ben Graham, who is a legendary investor, that in late years he would be all in cash, not invested, because he was so afraid of the next Great Depression that never happened.
yeah, yeah,
And releasing those and having kind of a beginner's mind, it's
yeah,
very hard but very important, because otherwise
yeah,
you will basically scare yourself out of the investment world.
yeah. And in equities, that makes no sense, right? Because, I mean, all the
No,
data I've seen show that if you stay in the equity market for a long time, you're going to win, right?
exactly. If you
If you
can have a
keep
longer,
panicking, pulling your money out, then it doesn't work.
there's a lot of fear that drives the market and our money decisions, and it's all at the wrong time. It looks like we're wired to fail when you think about it. The
Yeah,
survival and
yeah,
the short-term focus dominates. John, I want to ask you a big theme that's in your book, and I think the best way to frame it would be to talk about this idea that you brought up about hard work and hard thinking, how we go into business and we think that the harder we work, the harder we think, we'll find a solution. And then you
yeah,
propose this idea that there's something far more intelligent than our own brain, and
yeah,
how many traditions actually talk about it. And we
yeah,
can label it in different ways. But the concept of this is the limit of what I can do with as hard as I'm working. And then
yeah,
there's this outside almost voice that will point me in the right direction at the end of the day.
yeah, yeah. So, sorry, so what's the question?
About the existence of that higher presence
Oh, okay.
power, this super brain, if you want to call it.
Yeah, well, um, I suppose a simple way to say it is mm, the West has become very materialistic. Um, I would say, I don't just mean wanting more and more things. I mean, in
Mm-hmm.
terms of, it's called philosophical materialism, right? So a lot of Western scientists and others assume that matter is the source of everything.
Mm-hmm.
So are you familiar with Transcendental Meditation?
Yes,
Yeah. So actually, Ray Dalio is like a poster child for Transcendental
I
Meditation.
believe so. Yes.
Yeah. So I've never met him, but we have a mutual friend. So Maharishi, let's take Maharishi, who introduced Transcendental Meditation to the West, right, via the Beatles and everything. And so he was a physicist before he became a Hindu monk. And he explained it very clearly. He said, a lot of people in the West, they assume that matter is the source of everything, and consciousness is an epiphenomenon, right? So everything, and you can see this in neuroscience, right? So many people in the West, when they talk about some phenomenon in consciousness, they say, they then kind of point to some part of the brain and they say it's coming from there because that bit lights up.
Right.
Like when people meditate, certain waves happen. So they say, oh, okay, so they tend to say, well, the brain is producing consciousness and therefore this pattern appears and we can see it, right? So the Western assumption, I'm caricaturing, the Western assumption is that matter creates consciousness, right? What the Eastern traditions are saying is, so the way Maharishi explained it, he says, what the Vedic tradition, by the way, Veda means knowledge, just the same as science means knowledge. The Vedic tradition says that consciousness is the source of everything and matter is an epiphenomenon. So basically consciousness is creating everything, right? And so all these Eastern practices like meditation, yoga, healing, all these things, they're all tapping into this underlying consciousness which is running everything. Right, which so much of Western culture has got to the point of denying that exists. Right, but then there's a problem because you have this thing, you may have heard of it, called the hard problem of consciousness, right? So a lot of Western philosophers and scientists, they assume that matter is the source of everything, and consciousness is also coming from matter, but then they can't really explain how consciousness happens. So it's called the hard problem of consciousness, right? Whereas the Vedic tradition, is saying, well, everything comes from consciousness, and if you entertain that for a while, it becomes much easier to understand, because if that consciousness is running everything, well, I can tune into that consciousness, and then everything becomes much easier because I'm basically tuning into the source.
Exactly.
Right, that's what's happening, and I mean, I'm not a natural scientist, but I've had so many experiences. For example, I was initiated, the first time I met Swamiji, he initiated all of us to be healers, right? And I thought, what's going on? Now, I came here to learn about completion and getting rid of my pay pattern, and suddenly I've been initiated to be a healer. What's this about? And then about 4 years ago, I became fully vegetarian, just before COVID, right? 4.5 years ago. I gave up eggs, mushrooms, fish, and I became purely vegetarian. And all of a sudden, I started healing people, right? I gave up biology at school at the age of 14. I have no knowledge, right? And he started healing people through me. And there's a video, it's called The Science of Spiritual Healing. He basically says this energy is a combination of information and intelligence. And so you can heal people. And he says all the spiritual traditions use the same energy to heal. So, in Japan, it's ki, in China, it's chi, and, in Hawaii, it's called something else. But in India, it's prana. And sometimes I can feel it. It goes through my hand, right? And then the first person who I gave the healing to received that she had COVID and leukemia. She received the last rites in hospital. And we just carried on doing the healing. She got better and went home. It's like, what? There's no medical explanation for this stuff. There's no Western medical explanation. And it's happened so many times now. It's like, okay, let's just carry on doing it.
No, it's a very powerful.
Did I show you this? So he gave me this. So this is an Atmalinga. So I hold this on someone's photo. I only do it with their permission, but I hold it on their photo and I chant what we call the Mahavakya. And then, provided they don't block it. I mean, some people block it with their egos, unfortunately. But yeah, you can heal people through an iPhone. May sound bizarre, but
no, I mean, yeah, it sounds very powerful. When I was reading that section, I didn't go as far as healing, but I was thinking of looking for answers to difficult questions. That's what came to my mind when I was reading that section about leaning into that, super higher intelligence. And
Yeah.
And I don't know where that intelligence comes from, but just as a simple example, most of our education is organized around standardized tests, and you have 90 seconds to answer the question.
Yeah.
And I was thinking that in real life, and I have questions that come up working with clients and allocating their assets and picking investments for them and so on. Some of the questions, most of them actually take more than 90 seconds to give the answer, and we can sleep on it. Even our
Yeah.
grandmas told us to, how about you sleep on it, right? It's an
Yeah.
expression in many languages. And I realized that I think about it, I read everything I could ahead of time, and then I actually really sleep on it. And the next day on a casual walk, I see things differently. They got rearranged in my head, and I come up with something that might be an easier solution. And again, we talked about intuition, but it didn't come from a spreadsheet. It didn't come from a manual. It didn't come from a bullet point, but I'm tapping into what I believe is both my acquired experience for the work I've done over the last 20 years with all the families I've worked with. But I imagine that I might be also reaching for something that's outside of me. And it's an uncomfortable idea to even contemplate, but it's coming
really
from...
I mean, what some people do is they immediately say that comes from your subconscious mind, right?
I don't know where it comes from, but I know it comes and comes again and again and again.
It came from your subconscious. It's like an assertion, right?
Uh-huh.
But an alternative explanation, if you look at, for example, the best physicists
Mm-hmm.
or musicians or whatever. One of the best examples, are you familiar with Ramanujan? Srinivasa Ramanujan. So there's a film about him called a movie called The Man Who Knew Infinity, but he produced, I think it might be 3,000 theorems with no proofs.
Uh-huh.
And mathematicians have spent, I think, a century proving his results. But what's interesting about it is this stuff he basically downloaded. And as far as I can see, a lot of the best physicists have downloaded. So, and so one argument would be that your subconscious is processing this. The other argument would be when you allowed some kind of gap between your thoughts by sleeping or going for a walk, suddenly you download the solution. It just comes.
When you think about it, we all know it happens. I know a lot of people that realize it happens to them, but we kind of deny it, or that will deny the existence of it through the traditional education system and the tests.
It doesn't fit the model. You're a separate model. No.
But even the model of working around deadlines. I had a conversation with somebody. There's always a deadline for a project. There are deadlines, but the funny thing is that the better answer comes to you the day after the deadline. I would bet a lot of people listening can relate to it, that you kind of close the project, it's done, and the next morning you wake up and you feel like, wait a second, we could move those letters around or bullet points around, and it just looks better and sounds better, and we're getting somewhere in a better way.
Yeah.
It's fascinating how we build those systems that deprive us of this ability to connect the dots, and whichever way you want to label it, it does exist, and I see it happen again and again. And the same way as I grew more comfortable with being different, I grew comfortable with the idea that I don't know where the answer came from. I mean, I will be the one writing it down and saying it, so I kind of make a claim on it, but I'm not sure if it's really coming from within my skull or from somewhere else.
Well, I'll give you an extreme example. So I asked Swamiji, so the way he's described is the formless in form, right? So we're all this cosmic consciousness, but he doesn't have any incompletions, right? So he's like a pure version of this, right? And I said, please bless me to write this new book, which I'm writing, okay? And he said, I will write it. He said, do yoga and puja, I will write it. And the experience I've had recently is I sit in front of my computer, right? And I think, well, what am I going to write next? And then I look on Facebook and the answer's on Facebook. Or someone calls me up and gives me the next thing.
Uh-huh.
And so on one level, I'm writing this book. On the other hand, the cosmos is basically giving me all the stuff, and it can come from anywhere. Like I was helping someone solve a problem, and I realized, oh, that needs to go in the book. It's like,
Do you think that in those moments, and I can relate to that, I write articles, which the idea comes to me, but then over time, little pieces appear from different sources that build the article for me. So I'm the
yes,
one writing it down, but am I really the one writing it down? And I don't want to get too esoteric about it, but I feel like I become very receptive to a particular aspect. I'm trying to solve some problem or propose an idea,
yeah,
and it's inspired by a question the client asked, whatever it is. And then I
yeah,
write it down. And then the next 2-3 days, a week, the page fills up. And it's
exactly.
somebody else that said something, a conversation I was a
Yeah,
part of, somebody on the podcast, another
yeah,
conversation with a different client. But I'm very receptive to that particular. So I kind
yes,
of become this magnet, there's a gravitational pull and the ideas come to me
yes.
because I asked for it.
Yeah, well, it raises the question, the key question, which many spiritual teachers ask is, who are you, right? So if you
Mm-hmm.
think you're a separate body mind, then you have to do everything, right? If you accept that you're part of a greater intelligence, which you implicitly have, right? Once you accept that you're part of a greater intelligence, then this stuff can come from anywhere, right? It doesn't have to come from inside your skull. So,
Very much so.
it sounds to me as though you've already accepted that I mean, to use a you're not a standalone PC. You're plugged into the cloud,
Mm-hmm.
so you can download, right? Mm.
Well, I mean, just because you said it, I'm thinking about it. Let's imagine that you and I are born in the 1500s and we're
Yeah,
living in a different world.
yeah,
That network cannot provide what today's network can. And I think about it quite a bit, a lot about, connectivity and reach. Within a day, I can get on the phone, Zoom recording
yeah,
with friends that are in almost every time zone if I want to, right?
yeah, yeah,
It's remarkable how many moments of synchronicity and serendipity you can create that you could
yeah.
not create in Pompeii, Rome, year 78,
I,
79,
s-
right?
I suspect it happened. It just happened a different way.
In a different way.
So these days it might happen with some electrons down a wire, but
The reach of it, though, and the depth of it, it's
oh yeah,
remarkable.
no, yeah, yeah. I mean, these days it's become very measurable. I mean, here's another crazy thing, right? Well, sounds crazy. Is there are 430 Shaktis or yogic powers, right?
Uh-huh.
One of which is we can do this sometime. If I put if you put a coconut on your hand,
Hmm.
if someone puts a coconut on their hand, I can move it with my third eye, right? This is one of the first Shaktis that we learn, right?
Hmm.
But I can do it with someone who's thousands of miles away. So what is really interesting to me is a lot of these Shaktis or yogic powers, they work over broadband.
Hmm.
So they're beyond, they don't, yeah, they just, it's just extraordinary. So these ancient principles are completely compatible with modern technology. So,
Well, there's this saying that today's technology would be considered, magic, right? 100 years
yeah,
ago,
yeah, maybe,
and
yeah,
and I can only imagine that 100 years from now we'll be using all kinds of tools that today feel like magic or something
yeah.
that's not easy
Well,
to
even
explain.
aircraft. If in 1900 you talked about people flying through the sky in a metal tube.
And getting their peanuts and drinks served by flight attendants. It's hard to imagine. John, I have this saying that helps me in my profession a lot, and I say that I want to be the least wrong. I don't have to be
Uh,
right. And I think a lot of people get into investing and they just want to be right. They like the feeling of being right. And you write about it in your book. That's why I want to bring it up, because you talk about letting go of the need to be right.
yeah,
And you talk about meeting somebody with a different opinion than yours and asking them lots of questions.
yeah, yeah.
But I like that aspect of letting go of being right.
Mm,
And we often run into others that have a different opinion and asking them a lot
yeah,
of questions. If I'm
yeah,
buying a stock, somebody else is selling a stock, I still want to
yeah,
understand why are we on the opposing end of this trade?
yeah, yeah, yeah,
How do you think
yeah.
about it?
Well, the way I see it I think in investing, it's extremely important because when I worked at Europe's biggest independent fund management firm for 3 months while I had clinical depression,
Mm-hmm.
straight after school. But it was, looking back, it was extremely useful. And what I realized was the best fund managers uh, were were reading the cheapest newspapers, talking to just about anybody.
Mm-hmm.
And I do it now is I pick up such useful information. I mean, here's an example. I don't know. Did you follow what happened with Brexit, with Britain leaving the
Yes,
European
yes.
Union? Right.
I was there at the time, weeks
Okay.
before the
Okay.
vote.
So
Yeah.
you
Mm-hmm.
experienced that, right?
I have.
So that was a classic example. So a lot of people in the City of London were astonished
Mm-hmm.
when. So for those who aren't familiar with what happened, so in 2016, London voted to remain in the European Union.
Mm-hmm.
So did Scotland and Northern Ireland for their own reasons because they're different situations. But the
Right.
rest of England and Wales, which is like 10 regions, voted to leave, right?
Mm-hmm.
And most people in the City of London, in the financial district, were horrified and astonished, right? How could this possibly happen?
Right.
And that was, and it's a classic investment conundrum, but and that was because they spent most of their time talking to each other
Yes.
and other middle class people working in PR or medicine or law within a certain boundary of London, right?
Mm-hmm.
Whereas if you went outside London and talked to ordinary people,
Mm-hmm.
here's an example. Wales voted to leave the European Union, and I thought, why on earth did that happen? Given that they were getting so many subsidies from the European Union, right?
Right.
And eventually, I met this lady in a pub, a bar, right? Someone invited me to a birthday party, and I met
Mm-hmm.
this black lady from Birmingham who worked as a social worker in Wales, and I said, why did Wales vote to leave the European Union? And she gave me the answer, right? Or a plausible answer. So
Uh-huh.
what I'm saying is, if you can have all these opinions, like political or investment opinions, and you think you're right, and then someone in a bar sheds light on something, you suddenly realize, oh, now I get it.
There's another perspective.
And it
You
can
know,
be, and suddenly I understood. Now I understand why those guys voted leave. It's suddenly like they're not irrational. They had a perfectly rational reason for voting leave. Right? Anyway,
no, I have a couple of thoughts. One is that you would find me talking to taxi drivers wherever I go.
yeah, yeah.
And it's just second nature. I'm just curious about people and their stories, even the stories I will never read a book about because everybody has a story.
Hmm.
And I went to Omaha to Berkshire's meeting, Buffett's meeting this year. And I took a cab whenever I could because I could talk to real people, students that
Hmm.
are trying to make an extra dollar to go on a trip this summer, and people that are trying to make payments on the car they can't afford. You can hear stories after stories after stories. It's
Yeah,
fascinating. So
yeah,
I
yeah.
love that. I remember sitting in meetings, in an investment committee meeting in New York, and we were talking about a stock, and I don't remember which stock it was, but somebody said, why would you need this? Don't you have a doorman? And I thought for a second, they really think that everybody in the whole world has a doorman that can get their package delivered.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
it hit me like these are smart people. Some of them with more degrees than I have. And their argument is that why wouldn't a doorman get it for them? I'm like, no, most of America and most of the world does not have a doorman. I'm sorry. But I think we get caught up in a tiny little universe we live in that we think everybody lives just like us and
Yeah,
everybody
yeah.
has a doorman. And in New York, a lot of buildings have a doorman. But outside of New York, no, you go walk over and you pick up the box by yourself in your car. A lot of New Yorkers don't have a car, right?
Yeah,
So you have
exactly.
to be very careful and realize, how can I be wrong? And if I'm wrong,
Yeah,
how bad can it be?
yeah.
So it's a
Well,
it's
it's
a
like
fascinating revelation.
I mean, I know it's sometimes called the fallacy of composition. It's like assuming the whole world is like you and your friends. And
Yes.
you discover, no.
No, there's more to it than more of us. John, I could keep you here all day, but I want to ask you one last big question for me that I really like to ask, and it's a question about the definition of success. We've talked about letting go. We've talked about all the aspects of a certain philosophy that you pursue. How do you think about success? Do you think about it?
You mean what it is?
What it is to you, yes.
Uh, I would say for me, it's living enlightenment,
Hmm.
which is um, yeah, it's fulfilling your potential and living blissfully and manifesting things very easily. And for me personally, that a lot of it is to do with creativity.
Hmm.
Like I've always enjoyed I love photography and writing, and working with early stage companies is very creative. And money is part of that, but and also staying healthy and having happy relationships. I mean, in the book, and I'm doing the same in the new book, I talk about health, wealth, and relationships, and most people struggle in one of those three. I mean, there are super wealthy people who keep having health problems or relationship problems, right?
Hmm.
There are very healthy people who are always broke. I mean, the good news is once you remove your pain patterns, you can manifest all three. To me, that's real success, right? Why would you want to be fulfilled in two areas but not the third one?
Do you have to compromise?
I don't think you do. Well, no, if you remove those pain patterns,
Hmm.
I mean, Swamiji would say, he actually wrote something the other day, is it just become enlightened and then everything is
Everything
solved.
goes away.
Fantastic. Yeah, and a lot of people think enlightenment is sitting in a cave or after you die or something. But no, you could be enlightened now. I mean, that's what I want to do. I want to be enlightened now and then just manifest all these things, right?
I love the sound of that. How much can you tell us about the next book?
Well, it's about enlightenment, and it's also about manifesting health, wealth, and relationships. It's about the whole
What's
thing, and it's an extension of the power of letting go. It's not doesn't contradict it or go. It just goes further down the same track. So,
what's the timeline?
well, I
Is there
my
one?
my I cheat actually. I don't know if you know how people normally write books. People normally write a proposal, get a book deal, and then get super stressed about meeting the deadline.
That's
I
not
do
what
it
you're
the other way
doing.
around. Sorry. So what did you say?
No, no, that's not what you're doing, I imagine. That's
No,
not what
no.
you're
So I do it
doing.
the other way around. What I do is I write the book. I then produce a test version, or beta version, whatever, and I test it on people.
Huh?
And then I write the proposal, and my agent shows it to the publisher. And I say to the publisher, "Here's the proposal. Here's the book. 50 people have read it. Are you interested?"
There you go. Well,
That
I'm
takes
looking
all.
forward to that book, and I'm very excited about it, and I highly recommend The Power of Letting Go. It's a fascinating book that, if you really take it seriously, I think it can change how you look at things. And it's a book that I will read again because I feel like there are parts of it that take time for me, at least, to make them part of my life and my thinking. And it's just a fascinating way of looking differently. And it's a lighter way of looking at things and maybe not taking it as seriously as we think we should.
Mhm.
John, thank you so much for today. This was such a pleasure to have you on the show and have this
Well,
wonderful conversation.
thank you for inviting me. It's been great fun. And thanks to everyone for listening.